Darkest Hour. A short while later, the van screeched into the parking lot at Smith Motors. Jane leaped out and raced inside. "I can't just leave him there," she cried when she saw Selvig and Darcy. The two had been attempting to clean up the mess left by the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Darcy, however, had been distracted by a children's picture book that had somehow been left behind. Flipping through it, she half listened as Jane filled Selvig in on what had happened out in the desert. Suddenly, a word on one of the pages caught her eye. "Hey, look!" she shouted. The word looked an awful lot like the one Thor kept repeating, and above the word was an image of a hammer. Jane walked over and grabbed the book from Darcy. "Where did you find this?" Selvig answered, "In the children's section. I wanted to show you how ridiculous Thor's story is." "Aren't you the one who's always told me to chase down all possibilities?" Jane said. "If that's really an Einstein-Rosen bridge out there, then there's something on the other side. Advanced beings could have come through it before." "Like Thor and his hammer," she added silently. For a moment, no one said anything. Jane had never dared challenge her mentor before, but there were just too many signs pointing to the fact that Thor, whoever he was not from Earth, and now he was trapped by agents intent on covering up his existence. Finally, Selvig spoke. "I don't know what any of this means, Jane," he said, "but I'll help you because it's you." Selvig didn't want Thor staying in Puente Antiguo. It was too dangerous for all of them. But he also knew that Jane needed information from Thor, and despite his reservations, he knew that Jane would eventually guilt him into helping her. Selvig grimaced at Jane, who let out a breath that she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Eric," she said. He nodded and went to make a call. Now all she could do was wait and hope whatever plan Selvig came up with would work. Thor sat in a chair while one of the soldiers spoke to him. A small man, calm, not threatening. He asked Thor questions about places he had never heard of. He accused Thor of crimes, and Thor did not bother to respond. None of it mattered. If Thor could not lift Mjolnir, he was unworthy of his father's gift. He did not care what happened to him. After interrogating him for what seemed like all night, the small man left. Thor lowered his head. "I thought he'd never leave," a familiar voice said. Thor looked up, startled. Loki was there. "Loki, what are you doing here? What's happened? Is it Jotunheim?" Thor knew he had acted rashly. He hoped he could atone for his mistake. But what Loki said next made that impossible. "Father is dead." Thor was speechless. Loki went on. "Your banishment, the threat of a war with the Jotuns, it was too much for him to bear." "It was my fault," Thor thought. "I did that. I killed my father, the Allfather of Asgard, because I was too stupid to listen." There were tears in his eyes. "You mustn't blame yourself," Loki said. "I know you loved him." He paused and then added, "The burden of the throne has fallen to me now." Loki ruled Asgard. Thor understood this. It made sense. It also gave him a small glimmer of hope. "Can I come home?" he asked. With sorrow plain on his face, Loki shook his head. "The truce with Jotunheim is conditional upon your exile. Mother has forbidden your return." Thor was cast out from Asgard. Forever. He lowered his head. No wonder Mjolnir had refused him. He was unworthy even to be called Asgardian. "This is goodbye, brother," Loki said. "I'm so sorry." "No," Thor said. "I'm sorry. Loki, thank you for coming here to tell me." "Nothing could have stopped me," Loki said. He vanished then as the small man from S.H.I.E.L.D. came back into the room. "You have a visitor," he said. Behind him, the older man, who was Jane Foster's friend, burst into the room. Donnie, there you are!" Who was Donnie? Thor wondered. Then he remembered the name tag on the shirt from Jane's closet. It's going to be all right, my friend, Selvig said. I'm taking you home. Thor let Dr. Selvig lead him from the building. Along the way, they passed a clutter of instruments and machines on a table. Thor spotted Jane's notebook and picked it up as they walked by. He was not a thief. He was returning it to its rightful owner. When Loki left his brother, he did not return to Asgard. Instead, he visited another realm. The last time he had been here, he had fought at Thor's side against the overwhelming numbers of the Jotun enemy. Now he walked alone across the icy landscapes of Jotunheim, knowing that in some way he could not quite understand or accept. He was coming home. He found his way to the ruined temple, still shattered after the last war. Inside it was dark, save for the shafts of pale light falling through holes in the damaged ceiling. Jotuns appeared from the darkness surrounding him, but he paid them no notice. He walked deeper into the temple. Here was where Odin had found him. Here was where his life had been wrenched off course. He was a child of war, a refugee, denied his true heritage. Now Loki would begin to set that right. Ahead of him appeared Laufey, red eyes burning in the darkness. Loki stepped to him and looked up to meet Laufey's gaze.
"Tell me why I shouldn't kill you,"
Laufey said. "I've come alone and unarmed," Loki answered.
"To what end?"
"To make you another proposition," Loki said. Laufey's chin lifted as he understood.
"So you're the one who led us into Asgard,"
he said. Loki permitted himself the slightest of smiles. "You're welcome." But Laufey was in no mood for any humor.
"My men are dead, and I have no casket,"
he said.
"You are a deceiver."
Loki had heard that before. Laufey reached out and seized Loki around the throat. Loki did not resist. This, too, had been part of his plan. "You have no idea what I am," he said, as he felt the chill of his Jotun nature spread from Laufey's gripping fingers through the rest of his own body. Laufey stared in shock at Loki's transformation. The other Jotuns gathered in the temple shifted and muttered uneasily. Now Loki grinned. Everything was going precisely according to his plan. "Hello, father," he said.
"Ah,"
Laufey said.
"I thought Odin had killed you. That's what I would have done. He's as weak as you are."
"No longer weak. I now rule Asgard until Odin awakens," Loki said. He waited for this to register with the assembled Jotuns. Then he added, "Perhaps you should not have abandoned me so carelessly." Laufey paused to consider this.
"Or perhaps it was the wisest choice I've ever made. I will hear you."
It was time to make the deal. Loki led with the part of his offer that would be most tempting to Laufey. "I will conceal you and a handful of your soldiers, lead you into his chambers, and let you slay him where he lies," he said. "I'll keep the throne, and you will have the casket." Laufey studied Loki's face. The Jotun king was wise and crafty. He knew there was more to the offer than what Loki had said so far.
"Why would you do this?"
he asked. "When all is done, we will have a permanent peace between our two worlds," Loki proclaimed. "Then I will have accomplished what Odin and Thor never could." Laufey was pleased.
"This is a great day for Jotunheim. Asgard is finally ours."
And this was where Loki had to clarify things a little. He had no intention of giving up the throne of Asgard when he had just begun to rule. "No, Asgard is mine," he said. Anger tensed the muscles in Laufey's face, but Loki went on. "The rest of the 9 realms will be yours, if you do as you're told." It was quite bold to speak to the Jotun king in this way, especially in his own temple. Loki knew it, but he also knew the chance to kill Odin would be too much for Laufey to pass up. After a long moment, Laufey gave the smallest of nods.
"I accept,"
he said. Loki turned to leave. His business in Jotunheim was concluded, but there was much to do yet in Asgard. As Loki emerged from the Bifrost in the observatory, he felt Heimdall's gaze boring into him. "What troubles you, gatekeeper?" he asked.
"I turned my gaze upon you in Jotunheim, but could neither see nor hear you," Heimdall said. His eyes never left Loki's. "You were shrouded from me, like the frost giants who entered this realm."
Loki knew perfectly well that Heimdall was accusing him of hiding the Jotuns, but he had no desire for open conflict now. He preferred to work by stealth and manipulation. "Perhaps your senses have weakened after your many years of service," he said, putting on a sympathetic air. Heimdall did not let the point go.
"Or perhaps someone has found a way to hide that which he does not wish me to see," he said.
Perhaps a more direct approach would be required here, Loki thought. "You have great power, Heimdall," he said. "Tell me, did Odin ever fear you?"
"No,"
Heimdall said. "And why is that?"
"Because he is my king, and I am sworn to obey him."
"Exactly," Loki said. "Just as you're sworn to obey me now. Yes?" For a long moment Heimdall did not reply. Loki was unarmed, and Heimdall's hands held the double hilt of his great sword. It was a bad time for a battle. But Heimdall's sense of loyalty, to his role as gatekeeper and to Asgard, got the better of his suspicion toward Loki.
"Yes," he said reluctantly.
"Good," Loki said. "Then you will open the Bifrost to no one until I have undone what my brother has started." With that he left the observatory, but he felt Heimdall's all-seeing gaze on his back. Loki had a strong feeling that this was not the last time he and the Watcher of the Bifrost would come into conflict. Unexpected allies. Jane didn't know what Selvig was planning or whether he would be able to get Thor out of the mess he had created by crashing illegally into the shield post. What would he tell them? What if they arrested Eric too and kept him along with Thor? Every time the wind blew or a car passed by the lab, Jane jumped. Finally, Darcy sent her to the trailer to get some rest, insisting that she'd tell her when Selvig and Thor returned. Just as Jane was falling into a fitful sleep, there was a loud rapping on the door. Jumping up, she threw it open to see Thor standing there, Selvig thrown over one shoulder. Jane's hand went to her heart, and she let out a loud gasp. "What happened?" she said. "Is he—" She didn't dare say the word aloud. But then Selvig groaned and mumbled something about gods of thunder and realms, and she caught an unmistakable odor. It seemed Selvig and Thor had gone out to celebrate Thor's escape from S.H.I.E.L.D. She should have known. Gesturing behind her, Jane stepped aside so Thor could come in. There was something different about him. He seemed quieter, less sure of himself. She wondered what had happened after she'd left the base to make him act this way. Gently, Thor placed Selvig on the bed and then patted the old man's cheek. Yes, Jane thought, something must have happened. Then she realized Thor was no longer looking at Selvig, but glancing around the trailer at the empty pizza boxes, old newspapers, and cookie wrappers. "Can we go outside?" Jane suggested. Thor nodded, and they walked out of the trailer and headed over to the lab. On the roof, Jane had set up some chairs and a telescope, and there were a few blankets. "I come up here sometimes when I can't sleep," she explained. "Or when I'm trying to reconcile particle data. Or when Darcy's driving me crazy." She paused as a smile crept over Thor's face. "I come up here a lot now that I think about it." Thor didn't say anything. Instead, he just looked up at the night sky, as if it could provide him with answers. Once again, Jane was struck with the clear sense that the Thor she had known this morning was different from this Thor. This Thor seemed more human, despite the impressive muscles. Finally, he spoke up, his deep and somber voice in the stillness of the night startling Jane.
"You've been very kind," he said. "I've been far less grateful than you deserve."
"I also hit you with my car a couple of times, so it kind of evens out," Jane said, teasing him. Thor grinned and nodded. Then he reached into the pocket of his pants and pulled out Jane's notebook. He held it out to her.
"It was all I could get back,"
he said apologetically.
"Not as much as I promised. I'm sorry."
Jane took the notebook and opened it gently, as though scared it would disappear again. He had no idea how important this notebook was. It meant that she wouldn't have to start from scratch, that she could still prove her hypothesis. It was the greatest thing he could have gotten back. "Thank you," she said softly. Then her face clouded over.
"What's wrong?"
Thor asked, concerned. "Shield," she answered. "Whatever they are, they're never going to let this research see the light of day."
"You must finish what you've started."
"Why?" Jane asked, surprised at the urgency in his tone, and the confidence.
"Because you're right,"
he said simply.
"It's taken so many generations for your people to get to this point. You're nearly there. You just need someone to show you how close you really are."
As he spoke, Thor moved closer. Jane's heart hammered in her chest as he reached over and took her notebook from her hands. Opening it to the image of what he called the Bifrost, he smiled. He was going to show her just how close she really was. He drew a picture of Yggdrasil, the world tree, from which all things sprang. Its branches reached out to the 9 realms.
"Your ancestors called it magic," he said. "You call it science. I come from a place where they're one and the same. Your world, this world, Midgard, is one of the 9 realms, linked together by the branches of the world tree."
He looked at her. She was listening. Also, she was very beautiful, Thor thought. He kept talking, telling the story, just to keep her looking at him and listening. In the banquet hall, Volstagg did what he always did. He ate. He cleared platters of food, threw them aside, and went on to the next. Sif stood looking out the window, ill at ease, trying to think of a way to get Thor back to Asgard without Loki's interference. Hogun and Fandral watched Volstagg, awed as always by his endless appetite. Finally, Fandral couldn't stand it anymore. "Our dearest friend banished, Loki on the throne, Asgard on the brink of war, yet you managed to consume 4 wild boars, 6 pheasants, a side of beef, and 2 casks of ale. Shame on you!" he shouted. "Don't you care?" He swiped Volstagg's latest platter off the table. Furiously, Volstagg drew his sword.
"Do not mistake my appetite for apathy," he warned.
Sif understood. Volstagg loved to eat, but right now he was eating because it made him feel good in the midst of a bad situation. "Stop it, both of you," she said. "We all know what we have to do. We're just too afraid to do it." This shamed them all. It was true. They were hesitating because they were afraid. That kind of fear was not worthy of an Asgardian.
"We must go," Hogun said. "We must find Thor."
"It's treason, Hogun," Fandral protested.
"Not to mention it's suicide,"
Volstagg added. "Thor would do the same for us," Sif said quietly. The warriors 3 fell silent. It was true. They owed it to their friend, and they owed it to Asgard. But before they could act, an Einherjar guard entered the banquet hall. Lady Sif and the warriors 3 tensed. Was this the moment when Loki would move against them?
"Heimdall demands your presence," the guard said.
Volstagg looked gloomy again. He was thinking what they all were thinking. If Heimdall had heard them discussing treason, they might be in very deep trouble indeed.
"We're doomed," he said.
One did not refuse a summons from Heimdall. They found him standing at his station before the observatory's controls. He stared at them for a long moment, until all 4 of them were thoroughly unsettled and nervous. At last Volstagg spoke, just so someone would say something.
"Good Heimdall, let us explain."
Heimdall cut him off immediately.
"You would defy the commands of Loki, our king, break every oath you have taken as warriors, and commit treason to bring Thor back?"
The 4 of them looked at each other, then back to Heimdall. What could they say? Volstagg nodded at Sif, trying to prompt her to say something. She was the one who usually spoke without putting her foot in her mouth. She glared back at him, then looked to Heimdall. "Yes," she said, "but—" Now it was her turn to be interrupted by Heimdall. "Good," he said. For a moment they were sure they must have misunderstood him, but he said nothing else. Eventually Volstagg asked the question all of them wanted to ask.
"So you'll help us?" "I am bound by honor to our king. I cannot open the Bifrost to you,"
Heimdall said. This was a letdown. Sif and the Warriors Three were once again confused. Then Heimdall strode past them, leaving them alone in the observatory. "Complicated fellow, isn't he?" Fandral observed after a while. Volstagg waited another moment. He still feared being overheard. Then he asked,
"Now what do we do?"
Sif had been looking around the observatory, frustrated at being so close to the Bifrost, yet still unable to help Thor. Then she saw something. "Look!" The others turned and saw what she was pointing at. They all started to grin at each other. Heimdall had left the observatory, but he had also left his sword in the controls. The message was clear. He was letting them use the Bifrost, at great danger to himself. Now all they had to do was open it up and go find Thor. Heimdall took up his station outside the observatory after Sif and the Warriors Three were gone. He had his sword again and feared he would have to use it, for Loki was approaching him on the short spur of the rainbow bridge that connected the observatory to Asgard proper.
"Tell me, Loki,"
Heimdall said as Loki stopped a few feet in front of him. He carried Odin's spear, Gungnir.
"How did you get the Jotuns into Asgard?"
Loki did not bother to deny the accusation. "You think the Bifrost is the only way in and out of the realm?" he said with a smirk. "There are secret paths among worlds to which even you with all your gifts are blind. But I have need of them no longer, now that I am king." Then he grew more serious. "And I say, for your act of treason, you are relieved of your duties as gatekeeper, and you are no longer a citizen of Asgard."
"Then I need no longer obey you,"
Heimdall said, and raised his sword. He had known this moment would come. He struck at Loki, but Loki moved just a bit faster. Pointing Gungnir at Heimdall, he unleashed a storm of frost. Ice collected on Heimdall's armor, slowing the stroke of his sword. Heimdall pushed forward with all his strength, baring his teeth with effort. Still his greatsword moved, but more and more slowly. Loki's skin turned blue, and his eyes took on the red color of his true father, Laufey. Heimdall was a fearsome warrior, but even he was not quite strong enough to overcome the combined power of Gungnir and Loki's magic. He was frozen solid, with the edge of his sword scant inches from the side of Loki's throat. Loki paused. Gradually the Jotun blue left his skin and his eyes returned to their normal green color. That had been closer than he would have wanted. He leaned away from Heimdall's sword and turned on his heel. There was one final task to complete. The vault was silent. The cask of ancient winters stood on its pedestal. Loki stepped around the pedestal and gestured toward the gate holding the destroyer back. The gate folded away into itself, and the destroyer stepped forward. "Ensure my brother does not return," Loki said. A new tale to tell. The next morning Jane woke and stretched. Then she opened her eyes and smiled. Thor slept next to her, the rising sun turning his blonde hair golden. They had stayed outside all night talking about the Rainbow Bridge, the Bifrost, and the 9 realms of Yggdrasil, including Asgard, where Thor was from, and Midgard, or Earth. Her mind was spinning with information, yet she also felt oddly at peace. Thor had opened Jane's eyes to so many things, and she had opened her life up to him. She wondered what that would mean for their future. Beside her, Thor let out a small sigh, and then his eyes fluttered open. Looking over at her, he smiled. "Breakfast?" he suggested. A half-hour later, the smell of bacon and pancakes filled the lab. Jane sat at a table with Selvig and Darcy, trying to explain everything Thor had taught her. At the kitchen sink, Thor happily attempted to do the dishes. Jane looked over at him, impressed.
"They're fascinating theories, Jane," Selvig said, looking at the new notes in her book. "But you're not going to be able to convince the scientific community of any of this if you don't have hard evidence to back it up."
Jane was about to reply when a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent entered. There was a knock on the door before the agent stepped out of the doorway, and they all found themselves looking at 3 brawny and dangerous-looking men, plus a woman who was even more dangerous-looking than any of the men.
"My friends!" Thor cried, a delighted smile breaking across his face.
Breakfast forgotten, he rushed over to let the group in. The first to enter was the widest of the group. He had a long beard and a big belly, and he wore odd armor that looked ancient and futuristic at the same time. From their talk the night before, Jane assumed these were Asgardian warriors come to rescue Thor. The big man's next words confirmed her thoughts.
"Lady Sif and the Warriors 3, he said, his voice jolly. "Surely you've heard tales of Hogun the Grim, Fandral the Dashing, and I, Volstagg the Svelte."
Jane stifled a laugh while Selvig raised an eyebrow and gave Volstagg's belly a look.
"Perhaps I've put on a little more muscle since I was here last," he said, sounding a bit hurt.
"That would have been 1,000 years ago? Northern Europe?" Jane said, looking over at Darcy and Selvig as if to say, "I told you so." Volstagg looked thrilled to be remembered.
"Exactly,"
he said, smiling. Thor had been oddly quiet since Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 had arrived. Now he walked over and put an arm around Volstagg.
"My friends," he said, "I've never been happier to see anyone, but you should not have come."
The warrior called Fandral looked confused. "We're here to take you home," he said.
"You know I can't go home," Thor said. "My father is dead because of me. I must remain in exile."
Sif and the Warriors 3 looked at one another, puzzled.
"Thor,"
Sif said,
"your father still lives."
Jane saw the pain flash across Thor's face. He had not told her everything about the events that had brought him to Earth, but he had said that his actions had caused his father Odin to banish him and to strip him of his godly powers, making him mortal. Her heart ached for him. She almost stepped forward to reassure him, but she stopped. Lightning flashed across the sky, and the distant sound of thunder boomed. But it was not a storm. It was the Bifrost. Something had followed Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 to Midgard. Something much more terrifying. The sky grew even darker and the wind howled, sending trash dancing along the streets and causing people to duck into buildings for shelter. Jane felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She was frightened, but she was determined not to show it, especially not in the face of Asgardian warriors. "What is it?" she asked. Thor looked grim.
"I don't know," he said sadly. "Perhaps this is another one of Father's lessons that I just don't understand."
His eyes suddenly flashed, showing his determination to do the right thing.
"Jane, you must leave now."
She shook her head. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Before he could reply, Volstagg stepped forward.
"He's going to fight with us, of course."
Thor's shoulders sank and he turned back to his friends.
"Not today," he said softly. "I'm just a man."
Then, as though comfortable with his fate, he added,
"You must stop this on your own. I'll stay and help evacuate this town, but we'll need some time."
"You'll have it," Volstagg cried. With a salute to the humans and Thor, they walked out of the lab and into the growing storm. As soon as they had left, Thor and the others jumped into action. Racing out into the street, Jane began loading people into various vehicles with directions to get as far out of town as possible. At first, some of the townsfolk balked, but when they saw the storm in the distance, they nodded and got in the cars. Meanwhile, Selvig cleared out Isabella's diner and Darcy rushed to the bus station to tell the drivers where to go. Soon the place was virtually empty, more like a ghost town than ever before. Satisfied they'd gotten everyone out, Jane, Thor, and the others gathered in the back of the lab. They could hear the sounds of battle, and Jane saw Thor flinch as one of his friends let out a shout. Thor could stand it no longer. He stormed out of the lab and onto Main Street. Jane, Darcy, and Selvig followed. What they saw astonished them. Puente Antiguo's downtown was already in ruins. Fires burned and cars were overturned. And in the middle of it all stood the destroyer. How had Loki gained control of it? It should only have been responding to threats against Asgard. It must have truly believed him king of Asgard, with the All-Father gone into the Odin sleep. It was nearly impossible to defeat the destroyer, even for Asgard's mightiest warriors. In his mortal form, Thor couldn't imagine what he could do to help. But he was determined to find a way. After Loki had sent the destroyer over the Bifrost to Midgard, he waited in the observatory. Heimdall, still frozen at his post, was poor company. "What's it like, Heimdall, to know what is happening and not be able to do anything about it?" Loki asked. Only Heimdall's eyes moved. "Such a pity," Loki said. He shifted the observatory controls and opened the Bifrost again. Laufey and 2 other Jotuns emerged. "Greetings, father," Loki said. From a block down Main Street, Thor watched as Fandral executed a battle move Volstagg called the Flying Mountain. It was more or less exactly what it sounded like. Volstagg ran toward Fandral, who knelt and made a stirrup of his 2 hands. Volstagg stepped into it, and Fandral heaved him in the direction of the destroyer. It was a devastating, unstoppable move, even if it tended to be hard on Fandral's back. No enemy could stand against the hurtling mass of Volstagg. Except the destroyer, which swatted him away as if he were an insect. He tumbled through the air and smashed down onto the hood of a parked car. The destroyer's flame began to glow. In another moment it would incinerate Volstagg where he lay stunned by the blow. At the very last second, Lady Sif leaped from the roof of the nearest building, spear held in both hands. She put all of her strength into the thrust, driving the point of the spear through the back of the destroyer's neck and straight down into the street. The destroyer slumped and went inert as Sif landed on its back and steadied herself. Volstagg grinned at her. It was not the first time she'd saved his life. All of them were always there for one another. They relaxed for a moment, and then the destroyer started to move again. Its head began to turn all the way around like an owl's. The bands of its armor spun and reoriented themselves so that within seconds it was bent backward over Sif's spear instead of forward. The furnace within its helmet glowed, and the roar of its gathering fire spurred Sif to leap aside just as it shot a bolt of fire through the space where she had been. The destroyer pulled itself up slowly until it was loose from the spear that had impaled it. It turned again and raked the street with its fire. Cars flew everywhere, and so did Sif and the Warriors 3 as they were blasted by the irresistible Odin Force flames. Thor had to act. "Go now! Run!" he said to Jane. She did, with Darcy and Selvig. Thor ran too in the other direction, toward where Sif had fallen. "Lady Sif," he said as she struggled to get up, "you've done all you can." "No," she said through gritted teeth. "I will die a warrior's death. Stories will be told of this day." Thor stopped her from charging off toward the destroyer. "Live and tell those stories yourself," he said. "Now go. You must return to Asgard. We have to stop Loki." "What about you?" Sif asked. "Don't worry, my friends." Thor looked back toward the destroyer. It was searching for them at the other end of Main Street. "I have a plan." As his friends, both Asgardian and mortal, fell back toward the abandoned Smith Motors building, Thor walked down the middle of Main Street. The destroyer approached from the other direction, looming through the smoking wreckage and kicking aside cars. Jane called to the others to wait. "What's he doing?" "Brother," Thor said. He spoke to the destroyer, but he knew Loki could hear him. "Whatever I have done to wrong you, whatever I have done to lead you to do this, I am truly sorry. But these people are innocent. Taking their lives will gain you nothing." He stopped, looking up at the destroyer, which had also stopped. They were less than 10 feet apart. The front of the destroyer's helmet opened up, and the fires within roared to life. Undaunted, Thor went on. He had learned something in his time on Earth. True valor was not in simple fighting. It lay in knowing when not to fight, and knowing when to lay your life on the line for your friends.
So take mine and end this, Thor said.
A long moment passed. Thor steeled himself for the consuming blast of fire that he was sure would come. But then the destroyer powered down. It turned around and took a step back toward the place in the desert where the Bifrost had brought it to Earth. Thor took a breath. Whatever had come between him and Loki, they were still brothers. That was what he was thinking when the destroyer stopped, turned around, and backhanded Thor with all its strength. Thor flew through the air and crashed back onto Main Street more than a block away, unmoving. "No!" Jane shouted. She ran to him, with the rest of Thor's friends close behind. The destroyer strode away, out of Puente Antiguo and back into the desert. Jane knelt next to Thor. His eyes fluttered open. He was badly hurt.
"It's over,"
he said. Speaking was hard for him, she could tell. Was he dying? He couldn't be. "It's not over," she said.
"I mean, you're safe," Thor said. He was fading.
"No," Jane said, weeping. Tears stood on the faces of Sif and the Warriors Three as well. They could never have imagined Thor struck down in battle. Then they all heard something. It was like the sound of a falling rocket, or the sound of thunder. They looked up into the sky and saw something falling toward Thor, almost faster than their eyes could track it. "Jane!" Selvig cried out. He tried to pull her away from Thor, but she wouldn't leave. At the last moment before the falling object struck, Thor's hand reached up to catch it. Lightning flared around him, touching but not hurting any of the mortals or the Asgardians. It crackled around Thor, and they saw him change. His clothing disappeared, and a shining suit of armor replaced it. A rich red cloak appeared draped over his shoulders as he sat up, and a winged helmet covered his head. In his right hand he held Mjolnir. All of them thought they could almost hear words, like a voice was speaking distantly in all of their heads.
"Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor."
Thor stood and looked around, his wounds healed and his true Asgardian nature revealed on Earth for the first time. By sacrificing himself for his friends, he had proved himself worthy again. "Oh, my God," Jane breathed. Thor smiled at her, but on the edge of Puente Antiguo the destroyer sensed that Thor was not yet dead. It turned and rushed toward him. With a battle cry, Thor flung Mjolnir at the destroyer, knocking it off balance. It recovered, and blasts of fire struck all around Thor as Mjolnir returned to his hand. Whirling it over his head, Thor rose into the air. A storm gathered around him, growing more intense as Mjolnir created a whirlwind. The destroyer was lifted off the ground. Again and again it blasted at Thor, and every time he blocked its fire with Mjolnir. As the destroyer rose higher, Thor dove down through the whirlwind to meet it, holding Mjolnir before him and forcing the destroyer's fire back into it. Mjolnir blocked the opening in its helmet. The fire built inside the destroyer until a huge explosion blinded everyone on the ground. They flinched away. When they could see again, the destroyer was falling back to Earth. It landed with a huge crash and lay still. Thor landed a few seconds later, the thrill of the battle still clear on his face. Jane had liked his looks before, but now he was a sight to behold. "Is this how you always look?" she asked. Thor shrugged, more or less. She admired him a little more. "It's a good look." They shared a brief moment before Thor returned his attention to what needed to be done. "We must go to the Bifrost site," he said. The Warriors Three and Sif prepared to go with him. Before they could leave, a big black car pulled up and several S.H.I.E.L.D. agents got out, including the small man who had questioned Thor the night before. "Excuse me," he said. Thor turned to see what he had to say. As the man approached, he took in Thor's new appearance and said, "Donald, I don't think you've been completely honest with me." Thor had heard the small man's name in the buildings surrounding where Mjolnir had fallen to Earth. Coalson.
"Know this, son of coal," Thor said. "You and I, we fight for the same cause, the protection of this world. From this day forward, count me as your ally, if you return the items you have stolen from Jane Foster."
"Not stolen," Coulson said. "Borrowed. You'll get your equipment back," he said to Jane. "You're going to need it to continue your research." What?" she asked. "It's going to be very important," Coulson said to her, but he was still watching Thor and the other Asgardians. Thor could wait no longer. It was time to return to Asgard.
"Would you like to see this bridge we spoke of?"
Sure," she said. A few minutes later they stood at the great circle inscribed on the desert. This was the place where the Bifrost would open. Thor looked up into the sky and called out,
"Heimdall, open the Bifrost!"
Nothing happened. "He doesn't answer," Fandral observed.
"Then we are stranded,"
Hogun said. Thor wasn't ready to give up.
"Heimdall, we need you now!"
In the observatory, Heimdall struggled with all his might against his icy prison. He could hear Thor's voice, but Loki's magic held him fast. Asgard needed him. Would his strength fail him now, at this crucial moment? No. He shattered the bonds of ice and struck down the Jotun guard waiting for Laufey's return. The cold began to leave his limbs, and he felt his strength returning. There would be a battle coming. But first, he had to answer the call of Thor. Outside Puente Antiguo, the sky crackled open in a storm of color and energy. Selvig and Jane gasped. At last they were seeing the mythical Bifrost.
"I must go back to Asgard,"
Thor said to Jane.
"But I give you my word, I will return for you. Deal?"
She answered him with a kiss. Thor's heart thrilled to it. He had never imagined having feelings for a mortal woman. The 9 realms held many mysteries. "Deal," Jane said when they broke away from each other. And then it was time to go. Broken. In the chamber where the All-Father lay deep in the Odin sleep, Frigga sat by her husband's bedside. She had seen him succumb to the Odin sleep before, but this was deeper and more sudden than usual. She was deeply concerned and afraid for him. With Thor gone and Odin sleeping, Asgard was vulnerable to its enemies. From outside the chamber she heard the shout of the guards and the clash of weapons. The doors burst open, and a Jotun charged in. Frigga took up a sword leaning nearby and struck at it. The blade bit deeply into its shoulder, but it battered her aside. She hit the wall and lay stunned. Behind it another much larger Jotun came in, and behind it came Laufey. The Jotun king approached Odin and lifted the lid of Odin's one eye. The eye did not respond. Odin was too far into the Odin sleep to respond.
"It's said you can still hear and see what transpires around you. I hope it's true, so you may know your death came at the hand of Laufey," he said. In one of his hands he had formed a blade of ice. He raised it slowly, relishing the moment. A blast of energy hit Laufey from behind, shattering the ice blade and knocking the Jotun king to the floor. He looked up to see his attacker. It was Loki. He stood with Odin's spear Gungnir leveled at the wounded Jotun. Around Gungnir's tip crackled fierce energy. "And your death came by the son of Odin," Loki said, and unleashed another blast. Laufey lay still. The huge Jotun that accompanied Laufey lunged at Loki then and would have done him in. But it stopped short, its mouth opening in surprise. It toppled over slowly, revealing Frigga, holding the sword she had used to cut it down. Loki rushed to her, seeing she was hurt. "I swear to you, Mother, they will pay for what they've done today." "Mother!"
cried a familiar voice at the door. Loki turned to see Thor in the doorway, looking at the scene with amazement. "Thor!" Frigga said. She ran to him and embraced him. "I knew you'd return to us." Loki saw that Thor held Mjolnir. He did not know how it had happened, but he knew it was not good for him. "Found its way back to you, did it?" he said to Thor, nodding at the hammer.
"No thanks to you,"
Thor said. Frigga looked from one of her sons to the other.
Why don't you tell them how you sent the destroyer to kill my friends? He asked Loki. And to kill me.
It must have been enforcing Father's last command, Loki said, but he could see neither his mother nor his brother believed him.
You're a talented liar, brother, Thor said. Always have been.
Loki smiled at this. It wasn't the compliment he would have wanted, but it was true. It's good to have you back, he said. Now, if you'll excuse me. He raised Gungnir and unleashed a bolt of energy that blew Thor through the wall and out into the courtyard far below. Frigga screamed, but Loki was already on his way out of Odin's chamber. Loki had killed Laufey. Now the only thing to do was take care of the rest of the Jotuns. He had to end the coming war before it started. Thor got to his feet and saw Loki racing across the Bifrost Spur toward the observatory. A moment later, the observatory shifted and aimed. Its energy was unleashed, and a beam of rainbow power arrowed out into space, pointed toward Jotunheim. Thor swung Mjolnir upward and catapulted himself up onto the Bifrost Spur. The observatory's controls were encased in a huge version of Yggdrasil, the World Tree. It was made entirely of ice, and its thicket of roots held the controls in place. Thor would not be able to break it without destroying the controls, too. You can't stop it, Loki said proudly. The Bifrost will build until it rips Jotunheim apart.
Why have you done this?
Thor shouted over the sound of the Bifrost's increasing energy. To prove to Father that I am the worthy son, Loki answered. When he wakes, I will have saved his life. I will be proved a worthy heir.
You can't kill an entire race.
Thor could not believe Loki would do such a thing. The Bifrost would soon destroy Jotunheim, and with it every frost giant. It was unthinkable. What is this love for the Jotuns? Loki asked. You, who went seeking war.
I've changed, Thor said simply.
It was true. At the moment of his banishment from Asgard, he had still been foolish and stupid. He had learned much in his short time on Earth. Loki scoffed. So have I, he said, and struck Thor across the face with Gungnir. It was a soft blow, meant to provoke Thor. Fight me, Loki demanded. But Thor contained his temper.
Is the throne worth what you've done?
He asked. I never wanted the throne. I wanted only to be your equal. Loki hit him again. Now fight me! Thor held himself back.
I will not fight you, brother.
I am not your brother! Thor couldn't understand how Loki had become so consumed with jealousy.
Loki, this is madness, he said.
Is it? What happened to you on Midgard that turned you so soft? Loki's expression changed. Ah, it was a woman, he grinned. Perhaps when we're done here, I'll pay her a little visit myself. Thor had tried to restrain himself, but the threat to Jane was more than he could handle. He readied Mjolnir, and this time when Loki attacked him, Thor fought back. They battled back and forth with hammer and spear under the gleaming branches of the ice tree. Loki battered Thor with Gungnir, the enchanted tip of which could pierce even Thor's armor. Thor smashed him back with Mjolnir. Loki skidded across the Bifrost and slipped over the edge. He was barely hanging on. Brother, please! He cried out in fear. Thor reached to help his brother, but it was an illusion. Loki was actually behind him and hit him hard enough that Thor himself nearly fell off the bridge. Thor got his balance and spun around. He was surrounded by 20 Lokis. All laughed and mocked him. Loki had created illusions of himself. Enough, Thor thought. He raised Mjolnir and brought down a stroke of lightning. The blast knocked all the Lokis down. The illusions disappeared, leaving only the real Loki behind. Before Loki could get up, Thor laid Mjolnir on his chest, pinning him in place. Because no one but Thor could lift Mjolnir, Loki could not move the hammer or get out from under it. Then Thor went to the icy tree, fighting the surge of Bifrost energies and trying to get close enough to free the controls and turn the beam away from Jotunheim. There would not be much time. Soon Jotunheim would be destroyed. Look at you, Loki said, mocking Thor even though he lay pinned by Mjolnir. the mighty Thor, with all your strength. But what good does it do you now? There's nothing you can do." But Loki was wrong. There was one thing Thor could do. He reached out his hand and called Mjolnir to him. The hammer's handle smacked solidly into Thor's palm, and he raised Mjolnir to the skies. Thunder rumbled over Asgard, and lightning arced from Mjolnir's head. Thor brought the hammer down on the Rainbow Bridge. The blow was like an earthquake, shaking everything from the observatory all the way down to the vault, far underground, below Asgard's throne room. Loki scrambled to his feet. "If you destroy the bridge, you'll never see her again," he screamed. Thor ignored him. Loki picked up Gungnir and ran toward Thor as Thor raised Mjolnir again. "Forgive me," he said, and brought the hammer down again. The blow shattered the bridge into millions of glittering fragments. The blast wave rolled out from the breakpoint, rolling over the observatory and tearing pieces of it away. The great gyre powering the Bifrost spun slowly down. The beam of energy shooting out from it toward Jotunheim faded away. The explosion hurled Thor and Loki backward, tumbling them both over the edge of the bridge. Thor caught the edge and held on, but Loki was too far away. Stretching as far as he could, Thor reached his other hand and grabbed onto Gungnir. He held the spear with Loki dangling from its other end over the infinite space that stretched among the 9 realms. Thor's grip began to slip. He fought to hang on, and then a strong hand grasped him around the forearm. He looked up and was astonished to see Odin, awakened from the Odin sleep and looking younger, stronger, more vital than ever. The raging storm of energy pouring from the broken bridge still raged. "I could have done it, Father," Loki cried over the roar. "For you! For all of us!" "No, Loki," Odin said. He did not raise his voice, but somehow it carried over the chaos anyway. Sadness, regret, and a father's disappointment were clear on his weathered face. Thor wondered what the All-Father was saying no to, but he was never to find out, because Loki saw their father's expression. Thor looked from Odin down to his brother just in time to see Loki realize what he had done. He had betrayed the father who had raised him. He had opened Asgard to its enemies. He had nearly destroyed another realm. He had nearly killed his brother. The burden of it was too much for Loki. Thor saw Loki make a choice. "No!" Thor shouted, but perhaps Loki did not hear him. Or perhaps it made no difference. Loki let go and fell away into space, swallowed up in the endless spaces among the 9 realms, and swept away by the surging energies pouring from the broken bridge. Odin pulled Thor up onto the bridge. Thor staggered and fell against his father. He dropped Gungnir, and then dropped Mjolnir. "It is over," Odin said.